We refer to that as the acronym Triple AS. I'm also the instructor for RAC. I teach the first year writing course, and I teach it with a theme of race and identity. And so race and identity becomes the kind of intellectual space that I'm kind of immersing myself in, right? So I understand, because issues with regard to race and identity interest me a lot. So I'm certainly interested in that. And one of the texts that we're going to end up interrogating today, Sheikh Anta Diop's African Origin Civilization, deals with race and identity and how it permeates, all forms of our people activity and certainly the way our learning spaces. So my sub-discipline is in political theory, okay? And that being said, I'm looking at the work of three Afro-modern political philosophers or political theorists, Frantz Fanon, Sheikh Anta Diop, and W.B. Du Bois, right? Du Bois, whatever you want to say. And what their discourse says about instances of race and identity, okay? And these instances of race and identity are kind of somewhat peculiar to those regions that I'm looking at. So with regard to the African American or American context, I'm looking at what I'm calling the code of the true gangster. Okay, these identities that form around American gangsterism and how oftentimes they're predominantly kind of viewed, well, they may not be predominantly viewed, but they certainly have a racialization aspect to them, okay? And then there's this other aspect I'm looking at in Africa, how how ethnic groups have become racialized and how that race and identity and racialization process from the European colonial statement is at the heart of these ethnic wars. Okay, and certainly as in particular, I'm looking at what Diop has to say about, or how Diop's work can help us understand the Rwanda genocide, right? And thirdly, I'm looking at how Frantz Fanon's discourse on race and identity, whites, what is it, black skin, I'm sorry. He has a number of works, but he talks about how the colonial regime, the colonial government, the colonial institution, right, racialized blacks in a way to serve the colonial regime. So we call that the colonized mind, okay? So I'm looking at Fanon's work to understand colorisms, how they emerged in the Caribbean, and how, again, we're talking about the creation and emergence of these anti-black, anti-African identities that, again, are cultivated and often regulated under certain regimes. So that's what my research looks like if you can kind of like make it through those deep waters, And so that's about the size of it. Is this the time for question and answer?
I want to introduce
Okay.
Kalani also. So our second speaker is also third-year PhD student in African American and African Studies. His name is Kalanji Walton. And so he'll tell you a little bit of background about himself and his focus for his research here at MSU.
Greetings.
We'll do it later through email.
Greetings. My name is Kalanji, as Dr. Trotman said. I am a third-year doctoral student here at MSU. I'm from Romulus, Michigan, if anyone knows where Romulus is at. Did my undergrad at EMU, my master's at Eastern Michigan as well, and I'm doing a dual PhD in Black Studies and History here at MSU. My dissertation is on Black Power movement in the U.S. and the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. I study racialized societies and social movement responses to racialized oppression. And that is the short and sweet.
So we're gonna jump right into it, and we're gonna go based on the order we've already established. So Jennifer.
All right, so the context in WRA 125, we had the opportunity to read great African thinkers, certain excerpts of that. And with that, we learned about Black Egypt, and we also learned, we read many interviews from Sheikh Anta Diop, and we pretty much learned about his work in proving that, Egyptians were Black, and B, just pretty much, he pretty much helped, proving that Egyptians were Black, and also just his work to prove support the monogenetic theory. We also are currently reading BIA, which is Black Born in Africa. And so we're also getting supporting information about fossils that were found in Africa to support that man originated in Africa. So we are conducting these interviews pretty much to get your perspective on the information that we're studying, because we are going to end up writing a paper in which we'll write about different perspectives on the things that we were learning in class.
Awesome. So in there, was there a question? No, just joking.
Let's go, folks.
Hi, I'm Mia. I'm a freshman here. The first question is, what do you guys believe and know about human origins and Black Egypt?
Well, I'll let Elle go first since he was on time.
Well, that's a broad-based question, but I like to handle that, and these areas are probably going to overlap throughout this discourse, this conversation. But with regard to human origins, the argument or the controversy is monogenesis theory versus polygenesis theory, right? And so Sheikh Anta Diop certainly advocates this monogenesis theory. I mean, that's one of his grand scheme theories, right? Against what was probably or may have been the popular notion of a polygenistic or polygenesis theory, which means that, okay, so monogenesis, we've all come from one source, right? Mono, right? And that source would be Africa, right? As opposed to polygenesis, which the Latin speaks for itself there, that there's this kind of lineage of makeup, from Africa to Java man, Asian to Neanderthal, so it's all these different tributaries, these trees that make up the origin of humankind, okay? And that kind of, it does two things. Well, it's done two things under the auspices and kind of like what Roy B. Morrison calls guidance policies of Western European context, right? Again, it takes the credit out of Africa, right? And it privileges white origins, okay? So whenever we're looking at this, we're always talking about the idea of privileging white origins, and that's the fight, okay? That's the controversy. That's what Sheikh Anta Diop is doing here, right? And so he has to deal with race, right, in order to basically get there, So what you want to do when you look at this, you want to look at monogenesis theory versus polygenesis theory, the birth of the Negro myth, modern falsification of history, race reconstruction, and what I call memory replacement. Okay, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself.
Just to piggyback on what he said, and I'll give you my perspective. The birth of the Negro myth is fundamental to Dr. Diop's work, and I'll pass these books around. These are two of his books: Myth or Reality, Civilization or Barbarism. As I said to the earlier class, sometimes we don't believe it if it's written by a Black man, but if it's written by a white man, then we all of a sudden miraculously believe it.
Right.
So this is a white man who said exactly what he said years later. Black Athena. And this is the early groundbreaking work on this notion of ancient Egypt being a non-white civilization. And it's a controversy on George James's demise. Some people allege he was murdered for writing this book, but he died in a mysterious car accident. He wrote this book in the 30s. I just point out that Diop discusses the birth of the Negro myth, and I'm sure it'll come up later. For me, it's really quite simple. Science has proven, Dr. Joe, correct with the mitochondrial DNA that proves through women, and I always say this when I talk about this, men, we are not the dominant species, women are. And through the women's chromosome passed from mother to daughter, they've traced the origins of humankind to Africa. You all have African DNA through your mothers.
Right.
Everyone in this room, everyone in the world. And secondly, they found the skeletal remains of what the Leakeys called Lucy.
Right. Australopithecus africanus.
Whatever they just said.
That's a difficult Latin.
They've read about that.
Yeah, so indeed. And so the origin, according to the science, which is now vindicated, Dr. Joe, the origins of mankind is in the Great Lakes regions of Africa. We're in the Great Lakes of the United States, and the Great Lakes region of Africa is where science has proven the origin of humankind. So for me, it's really simple. It's a monogenesis, all this Homo sapien erectus stuff they was talking confusing. But monogenesis of humankind has been proven by science. We all have a common DNA. We only have a small percent of DNA that's different. It's like less than 1%,
That's right.
which makes everyone in here look different. It's very, very small, but we have common DNA, and they have found the skeletal remains and excavated and done testing on it and things of that nature. So it's
You had
real.
that statistic in your letter. I just read somebody's letter with that genetic statistic. It was really good. You don't remember it? Okay, you remember it, Sierra? What was the statistic?
Oh, I'm not sure right now.
Oh,
So many of you, I don't know, I mean, you're probably familiar, Dr. Travis introduced you to what Kalanji is referring to as the Human Genome Project, right? The National Geographic's Human Genome Project,
I
right?
didn't talk about it.
Oh, you didn't talk about it? Okay. Well, and what's interesting even about that, now check this out. Black scientists actually did this same experiment in the 1970s, along with Diop's research. I mean, in other words, they were taking Diop's philosophical argument, historical argument, linguistics argument, right, and putting it to task within the laboratory, right? But just like Brother Kalanji said, it didn't become validated until it was in the hands of a discourse community made up of majority white scientists, okay, or the American Western edition, okay? So we had known about this before, and we had known, and the argument of mitochondrial DNA was already postulated, was already waged. But again, it's like, okay, black people trying to, as a response to racism, now trying to create these kinds of cultures and ideas of black supremacy. See, that's how that's what they want you to reduce it to. I always use these concepts called minimalization of black history and reductionist theories, right? And there's this constant attempt to kind of like reduce what you're saying to some blackism, right, that basically has no legitimacy. It's just about you responding to racism, by doing the same thing. It's what happens to black people all the time. Black people are critiquing racism, and we're being called racist. Okay, so it's these fallacies that you have to be able to debunk, deconstruct in order to read the truth. And one of the main fallacies that Diop is debunking is white superiority, white racial superiority. He's not necessarily getting rid of the idea of race, right? But he's debunking the ideas that Europeans or people with white-like phenotypes, right, are the so-called superior race and have all these important places in history and make up the cradle of civilization, okay? Because it's important. So why Egypt, right? He who owns Egypt, right, controls history and owns the world, you see. Because Egypt has been has been taught as the cradle of civilization, right? So those who are the Egyptians, right, are the ones who end up becoming the primordial ancestor from whom all humankind has derived from or developed from.
At the very least, civilization.
Civilization.
At the very least, civilization.
Yeah.
And that's probably central to the argument. And I would emphasize, anytime I have this discussion, I emphasize what this discourse is aimed at is not to create a notion of black superiority. It is a notion to create the notion, it is designed to create the notion of human equality.
Yes.
That is the key. It is not to create a notion of black superiority, because there's no fruit in that. There's no benefit to that. It's replacing one false notion with another false notion, and will create another dichotomy of confusion, chaos, and oppression that will benefit humankind little to none. I believe it would further retard humankind. So that must be emphasized. Also, what must be emphasized is if we study Western civilization, what we all have, except for maybe international students who may have been not burdened with these notions of white supremacy and all that through their K through 12 education, but we in America in the West have, is if Greece/Rome cannot be identified as the historical classical reference points for Western civilization. And some people will be honest enough to take it a step further and say Egypt, who taught Greece, who then became Rome. So why is it fine for Western civilization to identify a historical classical reference point, but it is problematic for what we now call Africa and Africans to identify a historical classical reference point? And as he said, the fight over Egypt, whitening the Egyptians, et cetera, is very important to the notion of, if we understand the process of the Atlantic slave trade and then the consequential colonization of non-white areas of the world, dehumanizing those who will become enslaved, creating this notion of this birth of the Negro myth, or this myth of Negro inferiority.
Yes.
Enslavement and colonialism was predicated on those notions. And I'm not going to get into it, but it's a whole discourse that you can find in Spain and Portugal. They were the first slave traders, followed by the British and then the French, amongst their Catholic priests in the cloth, debating on how can we justify this. It is wrong based upon Christian ideals. The Muslims rectified it by saying, well, we will convert them all to Islam, and once they become Muslim, then they can no longer be slaves. But they didn't convert them all, but that's how they rectified it. The Christians initially said, the Catholics initially said, well, when they become baptized, then we will let them free. Then it went to, well, they are inhuman. They cannot be saved. They cannot become Christians. All they could do is parrot what we taught them, but they can never truly become Christians. So these are the underlying issues of how did it happen. And I'm sure through this conversation we'll get to other stuff that drives home that point. But I don't want to put the horse before the carriage or the carriage before the horse.
Right. I'm trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Because I want to piggyback off what he's saying, but I'm wondering if you all have more questions that you
I'm
want to
sure.
get into
Yes,
first.
we do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's go with the next question.
I'm Christina. The second question is, where did you learn this information and where do your beliefs come from?
Okay. Now, I learned this information, to be quite honest with you, this particular discourse, through academic training. Obviously, in Romulus, they weren't concerned about all these things. They just learn this stuff and keep it moving. So I learned it through Black Studies as an undergrad and then as a graduate student. And then I teach this stuff as well. So then I even fine-tune my understanding through the process of preparation of teaching. But my parents always taught me Black pride, Black history, African American history. And as a child, my father would say things to me that I didn't understand then, that, you know, the black man is the original man and all these abstract things that I had no clue what that meant. But, and he was teaching me it in that fashion so I could never feel inferior. Although I got straight A's, so I didn't feel inferior. But that's why. So he unknowingly was putting a little bit of that black superiority in it, which I feel is not healthy and not a good thing. But I've been exposed to this as a child, and my beliefs is I believe in the science. I mean, Dr. Zhao, he did a phenomenal job.
Phenomenal.
I mean, improving the argument and the way he did it. He used the canon. He used all of the scholars that Western world used to try to prove
That's right.
African inferiority,
That's right.
to prove African equality.
Yes, that's right.
So if you look through all his sources, he has all the big wigs from Herodotus or Herodotus, however you choose to pronounce it, all the way up. He uses chemistry, carbon testing, physics, linguistics,
That's right.
anthropology,
That's right.
history. He truly a multidisciplinary approach. He proved his argument, and he's been vindicated, in my opinion, by those who came after him, like the author of Black Athena, National Geographic, February 2008, on the cover, the Black Pharaohs. And it sounds like sarcastic, but I'm generally being sincere when I say it takes white people to say it for people believe it. But National Geographic said it. Now people are taking it serious. Prior to that, it was easily dismissed as fanciful, mythical, just trying to create a false history for the sake of creating black pride.
Right.
But that was to minimize its deeper implications of human interaction and human connection, because we're talking about Mediterranean societies. That is the crossroads of the world of human interaction. At the time that Egypt was the great power, it was the culmination of human knowledge. Then it went to Greece and Rome, the culmination of human knowledge. Now today, America in the West is the culmination of human knowledge. But 100 years from now, 200 years from now, it will be someone else. Because all empires, all societies, all civilizations rise and fall.
So you need to understand that about Egypt, So what happened to these black societies, right? Well, in order to not again be, have this kind of like reverse racism upon these things, you have to understand that black societies and kingdoms and empires, just like other human, are what's the word I'm looking for? Subjected to the same kind of, ebbs and flows. They rise and they fall, And he used the term minimalizing, like I did before, So be careful of this, again, because you'll see these constant arguments to delegitimize this stuff. It's even codified, in a kind of like slick way to make you buy again into the privileging of white discourse and white supremacy tinted discourse, And so, reductionist theories, minimalization, delegitimate organization. Is that question for me too as well?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So similar to Brother Kalanji, I grew up in a community that had a kind of black consciousness, right? And it was part of our school days. Like there were like Fridays when some of my African American teachers would put on dashikis, right? And wear their hair a certain way, and we would have like supplemental to Black History Month, we would have like these like Black History Fridays. Okay? These teachers would be, and that's like the principals and the educators at the time. They kind of like inserted this kind of like black cultural training inside of our curriculum, right? And plus, it was just a lot going on all the time around this kind of like black consciousness thing. And also my father was part of the Black Muslims, the Nation of Islam. He's a contemporary of Malcolm X. So no matter what your religious, perspectives are and what kind of stigmas you have about the Nation of Islam, a lot of what we call black consciousness came by way of the African American Islamic movement. Okay, and so I got a lot of that by being, you know, immersed in this constant flow of knowledge, and some of it was certainly black supremacy. You know, some of it was like the white man was the blue-eyed devil kind of thing, and that same kind of thing. The Afro-Asiatic black man, you know, and so, but like him, we heard that stuff, but we also went about like our own mission to kind of like find the sense and the balance and the non-racist perspective in that. You know, I read France Fanon at 16 and really didn't really understand it, but thought like it was the greatest book in the world. Who wrote this? Just the way he starts it, right? And so I knew I was on the precipice of some great consciousness awakening. And that's what this kind of experience is about. And so with that, I ended up going to Wayne State University and majoring. I was a double major at the time. I was a pre-med student and an Africana Studies major, right? And one of the things that was going on then, there was this doctor who was teaching us as future black doctors to be more African or black health conscious centered. So we would have like our biological science courses, and then we would have this sister named Dr. Shabi Ali, who had this kind of like minority black she was part of this, because it was like about these minority science initiatives to get blacks into science. I was part of that. But she would give us this kind of like black consciousness, you know, lectures, you know, and how could we as blacks go into these vulnerable population communities and help some with the health disparities now. So I didn't continue with the pre-med, but I ended up getting the Africana Studies degree. And then I came over to Eastern, EMU, and I met him there. And I did a certificate in African American Studies. And so I guess it had always been like intuitively my perspective, my passion to go into teaching black studies.
Basically, short and sweet, the space was created because of black studies for us to learn this information.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't institutionalized in the so-called traditional disciplines. The short and sweet.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Are you getting that? You understand that particular? Okay, great.
Okay, my name's Amanda. What are your guys' responses to the monogenetic theory? Like specifically your response to it?
Well, I believe it. I thought it was completely accurate based upon the evidence used to prove the argument or to prove the theory or the thesis. As scholars, regardless of the discipline, but I'm a historian, we read the book we read any text in three different ways. One, we read it for content. Two, we read it for the evidence. Three, we read it for the argument. His evidence is phenomenal, to be quite honest with you. People who try to attack him, they generally don't question his evidence. They question the implications of his conclusions more so than what his evidence is, because his evidence is thorough. So I think it's accurate. I totally support it, and that's how I teach. Like I said, and then the science and the scholarship that has come afterwards has vindicated him, like the mitochondrial DNA and the archaeological excavations and the remains that have been tested.
They moved from Asia to Africa
Right.
for the fossil finds.
Right. So I'm with him. I'm in total agreement. I accept it. I accept it as the absolute truth. I mean, and the thing about it, like you said, with regard to the evidence, they can't really tamper with the evidence because it's like it's so broad based. I mean, he's using linguistics. He's using these biomedical procedures, techniques. He's using history. He's using anthropology. So Sheikh Anta Diop becomes this kind of, for lack of a better, a Renaissance man with regard to his research and his scholarship, right? And so I usually start off these kinds of discourse with this idea of what Einstein calls the unified field theory, right? And the unified field theory and basically suggests that everything is connected. I mean, that everything is connected, right? That the whole universe has these connected kind of like parallel things, and so there's this constant influence from one cause and one reaction. Well, metaphorically, right? All disciplines are connected and interconnected, and so you get this thing called this interdisciplinary kind of discipline or interdisciplinary kind of awareness. So Sheikh Anta Diop takes all these disciplines, right, and connects them together into this unified field theory, right, that comes out as monogenesis theory, right? And if you look at those, if you look at the reverse, right, the polygenesis theory, there's so many holes in that, right? I mean, I've learned too that there was this tradition in black culture of taking the placenta, right? The afterbirth, right? And saving it, right? Yeah, saving it and then like digging up maybe a hole somewhere near a tree and like planting it, right? Now, guess what's inside the placenta too? Mitochondria DNA. So there's this cultural, right, kind of way of being, there's this cultural mechanism that's like oddly, right, supporting this kind of genetic mapping. There's this cultural mapping supporting this genetic mapping. So it's almost like this intuitive sense to leave these kinds of cultural evidence behind so people can trace back, who they are, And so but it's difficult, right, to accept for some people that we all come from not just Africa, but a black African and a black female. Because racism works in the sense that you want to be, whatever your so-called phenotype suggests your race is, you want to be that one. You want your ancestor to be the original one, okay? And certainly with regard to this idea of thinking that black folks are inferior, how could I come from such an inferior source in that kind of mindset? So you're going to get this constant pushback of monogenesis theory, even if some folks accept it, right? They're going to still kind of like take it out of Africa, you see. Like the movie, Out of Africa.
Like the book, not out of Africa.
Oh yeah, not out of Africa. I mean,
I assume
Mary.
Yeah, y'all have okay, but that's a contrarian response to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, to it's a poor attempt, to be quite honest with you. But I just mentioned it just to be aware that there are contrarian views, but they haven't been able to challenge the science. I mean, that's what it boils down to, being able to challenge the science. Until they can do that, it's really not much. They're just talking semantics and they're just talking interpretation of the implications. That's all that the discussion is the interpretation of the implications. Because, I mean, the science is there. I mean, we could draw each other's blood. If an alien came, and because that was one other alternative theory.
Cosmology.
Well, they was like, well, if it wasn't the white people who created Egypt, it had to be aliens. I mean, y'all laughing, but right now, you turn it, they got TV shows after TV shows talking about the aliens because scientifically they tried to replicate the pyramids based upon the technology at hand, and they couldn't. And that great museum in France is their closest failed attempt.
Right. Think about Stargate. Stargate has that premise. I mean, it's a whole body of literature, right, as well as film and other cultural products dedicated to this cosmology theory. In other words, taking it out of the hands, it has to be taken out of the hands of what they mistranslated as primitive people. Because primitive people could not have been that sophisticated and constitute the origins of civilization, right? So it had to be aliens tampering with the primitives to evolve a state of high evolutionary.
Mm-hmm. And depending on y'all questions, there's another conversation we need to have related to that, but I'd rather you all ask the questions.
Me too.
To draw that out.
Yeah.
And if y'all don't, then I'll bring it up.
That'd be
I
great.
have a question. In the previous question,
said you believe in science, right? Most people who study, like, if you believe in and the monogenetic theory, where does that leave you in the creation theory? Do you believe that they at some point they are related, they are one? Do you believe it's cloud view?
Well, for me, and I'm going to be honest, and that's been my difficulty in regards to being a good adherent to the 2 or 3 faiths that I've been a part of my whole life. I was raised a Messianic Jew, spent a lot of time in the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, the AME Church, and now I'm a recent convert to Islam, probably because my wife made me convert. She's born, raised a Muslim, been Muslim all her life, and if I wanted to get married, I had to take Shahada, and I wanted to be married. But however, is it's those type of issues. But what I've come to the understanding of is, in matters of faith and things of that nature, their attempts, based upon knowledge that was available to them at that moment in time, to explain the unexplainable. Right. At that moment in time. So I don't think a monogenesis theory contradicts, for example, the Adam and Eve story that the Abrahamic faiths hold to as the creation.
Not at all.
Now, I mean, I may argue that clearly it wasn't 6,000 years ago. It had to be, because we have the science to prove that was longer. But then, what is the notion? What is a year to God? If we are believers. Not everyone has to be, and not everyone is a believer. But for those who are believers who have this conflict, well, what is a day to God? What is a year to God? These are our constructs. And if we believe that the higher power is the higher power, then obviously they're not constrained to these simple notions that we use to try to translate and understand and interpret this physical around us. And even people who weren't believers, before these faiths were even created, people like Plato came to the same conclusion in their understanding. That's why he has like these fables when he talks about the table. That table isn't a table, you just think it's a table. And all these things for those who study philosophy or whatever. So I will argue that it doesn't necessarily contradict. It's in some instances, and for me, it reinforces. Okay, I mean, the timetable may not be what we've interpreted to be, but I mean, Africa clearly must have been like Eden.
Right.
Tropical Africa at the time before desertification expanded so far south. Clearly it must have been. That's part of the reason that we had colonialism. They was starving in Europe. They was living off sheep and potatoes. And then they had the potato famine, scarcity. And they went there and they went to the Americas and they was like, damn, they got shit falling off the tree, rotting on the ground. Rotting on the ground, just abundance. So, I mean, it would have looked like Eden to me if I could travel back in time in the DeLorean with Michael J. Fox and Back to the Future. It would look like Eden to me. So it doesn't contradict to me. It gives us maybe the scientific understanding to things that we didn't have before, but we were trying to explain. And that's what mysticism, mythology, faith, and human history, that's all it's been designed for. It's trying to interpret and understand what was ununderstandable at that moment in time.
Right. Well, I'm not going to say much about that, other than I'm in concert with his perspective. But being someone who's being trained in philosophy, and he mentioned this. One of the problems we have with these sacred texts, as we call them, is that belief oftentimes, because I've been studying these as sacred texts lately, our belief system oftentimes gets in the way of studying these texts critically, you see. And if one could sort of distance themselves from their belief system and look at these as sacred texts to be critiqued and looked at, then you could come up with these kinds of sensible connections, right? And so, that being said, a lot of stuff is not literal, but metaphorical and allegorical. And so, with regard to time, what is time to God, but maybe the time we're given is just an indication of something that happens a long time ago. And what we've also come to the realization is that many of these sacred texts are part of an oral tradition themselves. They're part of a collected oral tradition, right? And oftentimes, the people who have been referred to as the authors are actually people who are taking all traditions and recording them. Okay, that's why we just stated. That's why when you talk about Matthew, Luke, and they're quote unquote may not be the real authors of those particular books. Okay, so that's the thing. So these sacred texts are metaphysical or spiritual ways to explain the unexplainable. But what seems to be ironic, and maybe not so ironic, is that some of that, right, is matching up, right, with the science, right? Because Adam and Eve is a monogenesis story, right? Or spiritual theory, right? And so then Diop writes, and then National Geographic experiments, right? And they come to a more scientifically explained version of that particular theory, right? And there's something else, and I hope we get to this, and this is probably what he was alluding to. There's a Hermetic curse, right? That's also part of this tradition that's spoken about in the Bible that constitutes one of the justifications for this Negro myth. And so we can get to that in a minute, but that certainly needs to be.
That's what I was alluding to.
Yeah, I thought so.
And other things related to that same motif, indeed.
I was wondering about the Quran and what does the Quran say, and does it merge? Does it support the idea in terms of fossil finds and monogenetic theory?
It does, to be quite honest, and I mean, it's often an uncomfortable conversation for Muslims to have around non-Muslims. But Quran, to be honest with you, is an amalgamation of the Torah and the Bible. It is a remix of it. And some things are divergent, but it was a result of oral histories sitting around trade fires at the trade city of Mecca, people overhearing Christians and Jews orating, and it was in parts of the Quran is amalgamated. I know they want to say that Gabriel came down and whispered in Prophet Muhammad's ear. I know, but what it is it's an amalgamation of various stories from from Torah and from the Bible. They go hand in hand, all three of those books. And if we just say the Bible because the Old Testament is the Torah or the Mosaic text, they go hand in hand. They reinforce each other. It's just small bits of difference.
Right.
And I attribute that to the oral tradition, small bits of difference. But they reinforce. It's the same stories.
Right.
They have the same stories of Adam and Eve. They just, instead of giving them in the Torah, they have the Jewish names. And what we now read as the Bible, they have westernized names. Yeah, they just have Arab names, Arabicized names. You know, instead of Moses, Musa.
So you had this oral tradition, right, diverging itself around these cultural, geographical contexts, right? So it's the same stories, but taking on a kind of different cultural appearance, right? Because you're in a different kind of region, and there's this different kind of cultural production going on, okay?
Beliefs and practices.
Yeah.
No, exactly. So, and I don't want to get off.
And they all are results, and I mentioned this earlier. Those three books, those three faiths are results, they're responses to oppression.
Exactly.
Judaism, as we know it, is a response to the Hebrew experience of oppression in Egypt. The Christian perspective is a response to classism in that particular Jewish community, as well as when non-Jews became believers in Christ, the Roman response to their women converting to what we now call Christianity. And Islam, the Quran, is a response to Jewish and Christian discrimination and looking down upon those nomads and those trading people that we now call Muslims amongst the Arabs and the Persians. They're all three responses to oppression. So they interpret things based upon the situation they're in. Who, when, and where always matters. That's why interpretation change of the same stories. Who, when, and where. So that's simply what this, and I guess this is a good segue into it, because it was a time, and Elle would talk about it as well, it was a time that Europeans, for lack of a better way to put it, because back then they weren't Europeans and they weren't Africans. These are all social constructions that were invented later. Europe was invented, Africa was invented. They were just peoples living in these places. So who we would identify now as Europeans and who we now would identify as Africans, they had interactions way, way back in antiquity. And Europeans did not view Africans as being inferior. It's recorded in the histories written in 500 BCE by Herodotus or Herodotus. It's in the Bible. Moses married a black woman. King Solomon, King David's son. King Solomon would be what would that be? They said it would be, but he's a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Yahshua, or the man we call Jesus. He married a black woman. It's in the Bible.
Right.
So how did it go from these people are humans to them being subhuman? That space in between there is the invention of Negro inferiority, the birth of the Negro myth. They created Negroes. Negroes ain't exist. They were whatever ethnic group they was. They weren't even African. Just like the white people, they weren't white people. They weren't Europeans. You were whatever ethnic group or nation state you belong to. It wasn't these grand constructs that were invented later. You know, so that space, what happened? What happened?
Exactly.
And Diop has Joe has a whole chapter dedicated to that notion. That is that space of discussion. That is that disconnect that today we have to debate about the ethnicity, which is still not even accurate. But we'll just go with the melanin content of the ancient Egyptians at a moment in time. Because it changed too, because of migrations, conquering, just like anything else. Greece was once Greece. They had a civil war / revolution, and it became Rome. They changed the language because they didn't want to be Greeks anymore. So they took the same cosmology, that's belief, their God system, and they just threw new names on them. But if you look at the Greek cosmogony and look at the Egyptian, and you're like, well, dang, they just changed the names on them. So that's why this origins becomes very, very important. If these were non-white people and they gave Europe their core beliefs, their core societal, structural institutions, then what does that say for white supremacy?
Exactly.
What does that say for the epoch of white Western civilization? Roman, what does it say about that? That it was an amalgamation of interactions of humans in the Mediterranean region of multi-skin tones, at that moment in time, origins. But we all have that common origin. I'm dead serious. If the aliens came down here and took our DNAs, they'd be like, why are these fools fighting? They the same damn thing.
It's 99.9% that we all have the same genetics.
Right. Yep. That's
And that small percent is what makes your eyes brown, my eyes lighter brown, her hair blonde, him go bald, me going bald, but I'm holding on. And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That small percent has exteriorly this huge difference, but outside of that, if I'm about to die, your blood possibly, if it can save my life, and vice versa. That is fundamental on really how different are we. Your kidney can be my kidney.
That's right.
My heart can be your heart, my lung can be her lung. Literally.
Yes.
So I can't put a cat lung in a dog. I mean, it's real simple, but these myths that have been created.
So what happened, right? That's the big rhetorical question. And that's the critical question too. And I'm just gonna put it out there because I guess we need to get to it. So what you see in two instances is this. Certainly with regard to what happened with the so-called myth of Negro inferiority. Well, the transatlantic slave trade happened, you see. And so you had to have created these primitive subhuman people, these inferior people, these people who have no souls, these people who have no real religion, these pagan, backwards people who need Jesus, right, to justify, to rationalize, to vindicate, to make sense of, to make it deservingly so, to enslave them.
Make it divine providence.
Make it divine, exactly. Sacredize it. It's ordered, and using the Hamitic curse, it becomes ordered by God.
Tell them what that is.
So the Hamitic curse. So,
Yeah.
so there's this. So Noah in the Bible, right, has 3 sons, right? One named Ham, one named Shem, and one named Josephat. Just something like that.
Not Joseph yet.
Just Sephet, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that,
I'm drawing a
right.
blank on it also.
Right. Well, Ham is the alleged ancestor of black people.
But
Right?
why is it a curse? Tell them that.
Right, okay. So, Ham, allegedly, after the flood, right? Noah's tired, he gets a little drink in him, because he's like traumatized by the flood. Noah gets drunk, he's exposed with his clothing. Ham sees him naked, and there's this kind of hint of homosexuality, a homosexual response there, something.
Okay. You might be throwing
Okay,
adding that in there. But he saw his daddy's package and he cracked some jokes with his brothers.
So
that's what's written.
Right. No, this is part of the recent information. So there's this sin in viewing your father naked or a certain way, right? And so at that point, allegedly God cursed Ham, right? And he puts this mark on him, right? This accursed mark. And the accursed mark becomes associated with blackness, right?
Although the Bible doesn't say that.
Right, Bible doesn't say
Text
that.
probably doesn't
Right.
say that either.
Exactly.
And so all of Ham's descendants, because of this shame, must become the servants of men. So it's this idea that all of Ham's children will be cursed to carry the water buckets of humankind, something like that. And that's alleged to be, they all become servants. So that's where we get this kind of sacredizing of black folk being subordinated to a lower caste servitude. Thus, the transatlantic slave trade. Okay? Now, this is the real deal. And so this is used, okay, not just in religious circle, but it's used as what we now call scientific racism as well.
Or pseudoscience.
Or pseudoscience, okay? But also, when you understand that most of what we know as empires have all used slavery to build their empires, we get the first notion of race when empires start needing slaves, even before the transatlantic slave trade. So Europeans enslave other Europeans, right? And they start creating these inferior kind of connotations. So the Roman Empire starts creating these inferior kind of connotations associated with people who may have been like the Visigoths, the Vikings, those so-called wild people of Egypt. And so race becomes associated with them too, okay?
They otherizing, however you want to phrase it, otherizing. I mean, we get the term slave from Slavs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the otherizing.
Otherizing.
Otherizing. However, whatever it's based on.
Making someone an other, but a negative other.
Yeah.
Okay? And
Slavery existed throughout the world.
Exactly.
Africans were not the first slaves.
No.
And he alluded to this too. There's a trans-Saharan slave trade, right?
Yeah.
And there's a trans-Mediterranean slave trade, right?
Yes.
And so
And then it's an intra-European slave trade. It's an intra-African slave trade. It's an intra-American slave trade that history reveals. You know, I mean, and it's all built on power, domination, and otherization, and modes of production. But not to get off into my Marxist literature, but We need these people to do some things so we can do what we trying to do, get rich, stay in power, build this city for us, whatever the case. Just like, I mean, and even when race is involved, it's not really involved. It's created, it's manufactured. Race is a social construct. We think that the Hebrews were a different race than the Egyptians. But Pharaoh's daughter found Moses on the Nile River, took him in the house, and told Pharaoh, "This your
Check that
grandson."
out.
And Pharaoh didn't know the difference. That's my grandson. He thought blood. So these people
How is
couldn't
that
have looked
possible?
different.
Exactly.
But the otherization is what made them different. You see, I mean, race is a social construct. I mean, it truly is. It's a manufactured notion to create otherization for whatever the goal of that otherizing is at that moment, at that time. I studied slave trade internally in Africa as well, and they had different modes of otherizing. They all looked alike, just like in Europe, you know, for the most part. You know, you can say, well, they're tall people, they're short people, their nose a little wider, or whatever the case. But generally speaking, they all looked alike. So they used another way to otherize, you know, just as Europeans did, like the Franks and the Germanic people. You know, those Rome's key enemies was what we would now call the Austrians and the Germans. They were their key enemies, but they were barbarians.
Yeah.
They're savages. You know, that's the language that they use, just to otherize them. That's all it was. I mean, you got to go send out people to enslave and kill hundreds of thousands of people. They can't view them as human. I mean, we seen it with our military people. I was in the military. My brother just retired from the military. He fought in all the wars since 1990 for the United States of America. I mean, they had to do their best in an abstract way to convince them that those brown people over in the Middle East were somehow less than human. Or how could he come from a boy who wouldn't even go outside and play to going over there and killing at least 20 confirmed kills?
So that brings me to this other critical question that I always ask over and over again, especially dealing with Diop. What is the power of a lie? A hegemonic lie. A lie that serves the domination of certain the domination for certain geopolitical and economic interests. What is the power of a lie told over and over and over and over again? He just referenced one. You know, they had to make these people into some subhuman types in order to mobilize these kinds of violent actions of soldiering, right? From this particular soldier body, this particular American army, right? That's the power of a lie, right? So these powers of lies, these impact of historical and cultural lying or deception, or what we refer to sometimes as miseducation, right? Create these cultures of violence and cultures of movement, the destructions of that particular race, the disposal of those people. I'm dealing with this theory that I'm looking at when I'm teaching in class. The disposal of vulnerable populations, the disposal of black people through lynching culture and sanctioned murder. You know, from Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. You know, if many of you may not know Emmett Till, but Emmett Till marks one of the most visibly violent occurrences of a lynching ever done to an African American boy, 16 years old, such that his face was just disfigured and destroyed, and his mother had this open casket to America in order to show America the ugliness of its racism, you see, and which in that particular moment ended up galvanizing the civil rights movement. If people were scared to march, right, or protest now, when they saw Emmett Till, they said, okay, this is something that's so sick, that's so evil, so bad, I'm willing to die for it.
I know y'all got some more questions.
Yeah, so.
Probably should go to 5, because don't you think 4 is already done?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were your beliefs before studying human origins?
That's a good question. Like I said, my father would always say things to me that I truly couldn't interpret or understand on a high critical thought. I mean, because I was simply a child. I really hadn't thought about it much. You know, I was, you know, basically, as many of you all are, and many of your peers, and many of our parents, and many of our grandparents, truly just disengage from these critical questions. You know, just going along, just a sheep blind in the woods. To be quite honest with you, so that's what makes the impact of these things that we're discussing more profound for me as an individual, because I never thought of that. I never had thought about, well, what the hell did Adam and Eve even look like? Never had even occurred to me that they had to look like something. You know, I see these pictures in these old Bibles when I was going to the AME church. Ironic enough, because they'll have a picture of a black Jesus, but the Bibles they were using have all white people in the books. But I just never thought about it. Like, that's must have what they look like. I never made the connection until I got older that Nubia is in Africa. The Queen of Sheba is a queen of an African empire. And King Solomon married her. Never thought about it, never made the connection until critically engaging these types of readings and studies.
Well, again, for me, two things. Like I told you about these Fridays where we would have like these African American kind of like history immersions. Well, my teacher would have like Budweiser did this series, right? Where they had like all the black kings and queens and stuff like that, right? And so I'm introduced to this like in elementary, right? They got these things on the right. So my curiosity is being piqued already, right? And then there was this nagging intuitive thing from like growing up on Tarzan, right? And the way like the blacks in the movies are always characterized as like primitive, stupid jungle bunnies who like, and so this Tarzan is this white man who comes to Africa and like conquers all these dumb black people, right? Well, that shit bothered me, excuse me, even as a little kid, right? It just, and that's what I'm saying. Now, I mean, wow, black people can't be that dumb. I mean, it's like somebody who's white and racist wrote this to make us look a certain way. I got it then, okay? And so I always said, why is it that white people, okay, supposedly, allegedly did everything? Had the best of everything, you know? It has this place in history that's like the best of everything, right? So there's this intuitive kind of nagging that made me search for stuff. So I'm reading The Miseducation of the Negro in Junior High, right? I'm reading Franz Fanon, trying to figure this stuff out. At the same time, I got these Muslims and these other people telling me all this stuff. So I'm being bombarded. When I go to my father's house in Cleveland summertime, he's got pictures of Black Jesus, okay? So it's there for me, you know, and so that's, so in some ways, I was not so disengaged, so the question was being put to me in ways, you know, why do you think this is important? So I began this journey of knowledge seeking at a very young age, even not knowing how to decipher and decode most of the stuff I was reading, you know. So, but on the other hand, I had like other people in my family, right, who was like on Good Times, Florida with the white Jesus, and that's like, and so I'm like a young person like causing problems because I'm like critiquing their stuff, and it's like, so I become like certainly outlawed in these circles where, you know, people say Jesus has no color, but they got white Jesus in the room. See, that again is deceptive intellectualism. That's what I call it. It's being deceptive. Well, if Jesus has no color, let's just take all the Jesus pictures down then, right? But no, even though Jesus has no color, he still has to be retained in our minds as white. See, somebody's playing us, right? Go ahead, next. I'm sorry.
I'm Jess, and what do you think is the possible impact of human origins information if disseminated throughout the world?
It undermines any notion of any type of racial superiority in any concept, or any type of racial inferiority of any kind, because it says, well, we all have a commonality, we all have a common history, a common ancestor, a common mother, to lean on the mitochondrial DNA aspect. We all have a common mother. So what does that say about us if I view you because you externally look slightly different? I view you as an inferior, but we have a common ancestor. So your inferiority becomes in part my inferiority. My notion of your superiority, if I've internalized an inferiority complex, then your superiority then becomes my superiority. So I believe it has the potential, and I think it will and would and should lead to an equalizing effect. Notions of human equality. And then it makes us have to interpret, well, if this group of people, if we go to like the Democratic Republic of Congo today, or go to to Rwanda, or if we go to parts of Afghanistan, if we go to parts of Eastern Europe, where there's these catastrophic, chaotic infighting and et cetera, catastrophes, human-caused catastrophes, then that had to have been created. It is not inherent that they will behave this way. It is not inherent that they will live in this poverty, this underdevelopment. It is not inherent that they do not have technology. It is a creation. What created that? It causes a conversation to be had that people don't want to have, because then we get into culpability and people don't want to discuss that. So that's what I think the implication, one of the greatest implications of that notion has for the present and the future.
Yeah, I deal with this this research where I'm taking, as I stated, I'm dealing with DIOP as a discourse to basically look at these problems, right? So I'm not just looking at them to leave them there, right? I'm looking at them, okay, in a way now, how can I go about helping society transcend these racial, problems? So for me, Diop's text and his theory represents what I'm calling transcendence discourse, okay?
Transcendence.
Transcendence,
Transcendence.
discourse. So discourse that may help us to transcend these racial issues once we become acutely aware and conscious of them. Okay? So the idea is to try to reconstruct a society, and we're never going to get rid of race. Okay? So I'm not like talking about post-racial. So let me not mislead you. I'm not talking about post-racial. I'm not even talking about the idea of eliminating race, because I don't think we can do that. I think race is so embedded as a human quality now that we may not be able to ever get rid of it. But what I am talking about is the decrease in using race as a modus operandi, as a mode of operationalism or operating in society to keep that constantly mistreats one particular people, right, as opposed to the other. Like maybe someday the Trayvon Martins won't be as frequent. You know what I'm saying? That sort of thing. And Carter G. Woodson says lynching starts in the classroom. You see? So just in this moment, right, if we can recapture the minds, right, that have been like racially conditioned towards these kinds of maintenance of white supremacy and white privilege, then we can stop the lynching that takes place in the classroom, and maybe we won't have as many Trayvon Martins or Oscar Grants occurring. And certainly, we're not the ones doing that, right? We're not law enforcement, right? But law enforcement got their education from somewhere too.
So you understand transcendence discourse. Does that make sense to you?
Like Barack Obama was held as a client, as a presidential candidate who, what's my man's name? The retired Colonel General Colin Powell called him a transformational figure. And so transformational is akin to transcendent. It was alleged that Barack Obama transcended race, right, in his rise towards the presidential race. Well, I'm suggesting, my hope is that Diop's work also will serve a purpose to help us transcend race in some of these sinister ways. And certainly in academic discourse, which we're involved in right now, right?
Yeah, I think you got a lot to work with. I think you got a lot of terminology.
You get real theoretical.
I hope you, and so if you didn't get everything, of course, we have the recordings. You can play those and we'll try to get those posted as soon as possible. We may be able to post it today.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have that information. Okay, I am very attentive to you. I look at you to see where you are. So hang in there, folks. Let's press a little bit forward. I hope you're getting information. I hope you're understanding. Okay, let's go to the next person.
We can break it down. I mean, and we can have later conversations via email because we want to simplify. One of his mantras is like, just to make it real simple, right? And I believe in that. Keep it simple, shorty. You know, that's my new saying. Go ahead.
Was there an additional question?
Yes, we have more. Next. Byron is not here, so somebody can ask that one. Number 7. Maria, why don't you do it? Maria, you have the questions in front of you? Number 7. Okay, let's let Paula go ahead since do you have one already? You have one already. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. The question is, why does the media and education system continue to hide this information?
Wow, can you take that?
Well, part of it is because it's learned behavior. It is what we call the normative narrative. And you know, when I teach certain classes, like I'm teaching RAC 150, I use the motif of narrative and counter narrative. So it's the normative narrative. That is what has been taught to them, who has been taught to those who taught them, and those who taught them, who taught them, who taught them. That's part of it. Secondly, unfortunately, to be honest with you, many people resist change. Many people are uncomfortable with this because they feel it doesn't necessarily suit their ends and their goals. Right. And to be quite frank, you know, many of us have been led to believe that desegregation and the end of white supremacy happened in 1965. But there's still civil rights and desegregation cases that are going to be argued in front of the Supreme Court right now. And like in the 1970s, my father retired from Detroit Public Schools. They were still, as a boiler engineer, they were still fighting school busing and desegregation when I was born in 1975. We could look at Boston. They with the Southeast response and brutalization, you thought it was Birmingham 1952. You know, I mean, so this stuff that we're discussing is still hot issues in the system that was created under slavery and Jim Crow segregation in the United States of America. We're not far removed from that. Like literally, in my lifetime, and I was born in 1975. You know, so that's why a lot of these things still have to be dismantled. Some of these things still have to be integrated in the school system to be in school textbooks. And it hasn't, and they're fighting over it right now. The number 2 states that produce textbooks are Texas and California. And the Department of Education in Texas just voted to remove, what's the black judge, first black judge?
Thurgood Marshall?
Thurgood Marshall. They just voted to remove him out of the textbook, said he's an inconsequential historical figure.
Right.
Thurgood Marshall, he argued in front of the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education, which was really like 6 cases, but the one we identify as that is Brown versus Board of Education. But that's 1954, May 17, 1954. And in the 70s, they were still trying to implement it, and they're still arguing it in the Supreme Court today. And they want to remove him from the textbooks. First black, I'll put it in a better way. First non-white male Supreme Court justice in the United States of American history. He's an inconsequential historical figure. So if they want to remove him from textbooks, they dang sure ain't trying to put Black Egypt in the textbook. So I mean, this isn't yesterday's issue. Like, you all are involved in the issue right now, whether you realize it or not. Those of you who all be educators, who want to be K through 12 teachers, these are issues you're going to have to deal with in 3 or 4 years. Those of you who will go into public policy, I mean, these are issues that you all will have to deal with in 3 to 4 to 7 years, depending on your education path or graduate school or whatnot. This isn't no far distant past. And that's what I'm always amazed by the students, that's in your age group. Because in part, their parents have misled them. Black parents are the best at it. I'm gonna keep it real. They'll tell y'all black students, oh no, it's all good. You can go to college now. You can live next to white people now. It's all good. No, it's not. That's part of the trick. My parents told me when we were protesting in undergrad, because they didn't have MLK Day off and we had police harassment and brutality, I didn't send you to college for that. I kindly, being a good son, said, I understand. That's because you didn't know what I was going to arrive and face. Because my parents they didn't graduate high school. My dad got a GED. My mom never even got a GED. So they had no clue what they were sending me off to. They just knew it was better than what they faced. And it is and it was. But it's not, the battle isn't over. Everything isn't hunky-dory. We're not in that fantastic world that people like to say Dr. King was talking about in 8 seconds of like a 2-hour speech.
So yeah, as Brother Kalanji stated, and there's some points I'm gonna take diverge over. But I'm looking at 3 things here, right? Something I've been telling other students is that the power of racism is in its lack of acknowledgement. Okay? And so the power of racism is in its lack of acknowledgement. And this tendency towards dismissal, this tendency towards denial, I call them denial artists and dismissal theories, okay? And you get these old dismissal theories, it ain't happening, it ain't here, we're post-racial, right? And so what he said in a particular speech on conference in Trayvon Martin, right? Mm-hmm. The new racism is the omission of it, yes, is the denial of it. The new racism is the omission and the denial of it. Because it just reinforces racism to a normative. And so what has happened is that we've normalized academic racism, you see. So when you talk about why is this information not put out there, so what racism is such that it constantly reproduces itself wherever it's at. So if racism exists in society outside of academia, it exists in academia as academic racism, okay? So this constant tendency towards creating these homogenous communities. And if they're not all homogenous, if they're not all looking the same, they want us to all think the same. So what's being privileged? White European discourse, okay? And so why is that being privileged, okay? The second thing, the reason things are held on to, there's certainly this problem with unlearning something. But the reason we don't want to unlearn it because it satisfies some benefit.
Indeed.
Okay? There's some privilege to it, right? You don't let stuff go because there's some privilege to it. And that's the other deception of racism. Denying the privilege. Denying the benefit. I grew up poor white. I had to work. What white privilege do I have? You hear it all the time, right? But that's also a kind of connotation or expression of a reality that's disconnected, second or third point. Disconnected or disengaged from the fundamental reality of race. Which means, how many times do you get racially profiled? Okay? So, those kinds of things. The privilege or benefit aspect to retaining these things, right? The difficulty with unlearning that because of that benefit, right? And so this culture of lying about racism over and over again. And the more you're insulated from the fundamental reality of race, the more you develop this perspective that it really doesn't exist. It's non-existent. Or again, that's black people or minorities constantly complaining about something that they're not going through. Hence, the fallacy of playing the race card. I mean, I'm watching, and I'm going to get off this point so we can keep moving on, but I was watching one of those news reports where one of the news stations, they do these scenarios like, what would you do, right? And so you got one of these store actors, a white lady, mistreating a black customer on purpose, right? And nobody does anything except a couple of white ladies speak out, right? And then some of the white people who walk away, one of the guys outside says, what was she doing, playing the race card again? Now, how is she playing the race card again and she's being victimized, right, by the white woman intentionally to make a point about racism, right? So I admonish students, be careful, don't buy into this whole idea of playing the race card. No one has to play the race card in a society that's racist to begin with.
Carl G. Woodson said it best. It's one quick sentence. If you control a person's mind, you control their actions. That's what it boils down to. If they can control the minds, they control the actions. They lose control of minds if these type of things are widely discussed. I mean, we have an epidemic of mass incarceration of young black and brown boys. It's easily to justify that they are inherently criminal without having to interrogate. Well, no, they can't be inherently criminal because of look of these things. They aren't inherently counterproductive to society because their ancestors contribute to the foundational ideas and concepts that has created our society, our civilization. If we talk about Black Egypt and relating it to its development of Western civilization. It's too problematic. He said, is there a game? They have a game. I mean, racism wouldn't exist if it wasn't a game. If it wasn't a financial game. Let's get right to it. More so power, because finance is just a use of power or an example, a manifestation of power. So power is at stake. Just look at the elections now. I don't care what side you're on and all that. It's inconsequential to me. But right now, they having these grand debates, supposedly, right? And the foundational issue that they're arguing over is, these people need help, and the counter argument is no. These people need help. So they both can't agree on what group of people need help. It's what it really boils down to. One side say these people need help because they're job creators. This other side say these people need help because they can't find a job. So they're debating. So one side is demonizing the other. And that's the greatest example of that.
The last point to that, racism is normal and adaptive. That's why it keeps going on again. It's normal. It's not idiosyncratic, okay? It's not some aberration or all about people who are like KKKs, right? See, that's the biggest farce, So racism is practiced in a normal, covert way every day. And it constantly readapts itself around these spaces of power, okay? So once you understand that, and why is it normative? Because of the benefit, right? So once you start to understand that, then you realize why why we have these traditions that support it through the suppression of a kind of awakening knowledge.
Okay, next.
Have your preconceptions been influenced by false representations? Explain.
Oh yeah, growing up in America as a young black boy, it was hard for me not to, right? It was a brief time, although I was doing great in math in elementary school. I was like 2 grades ahead in math and reading and had to go to the junior high when I was in the 4th grade for those classes. But it got to a time real quick, despite all that, black people ain't good at math. I came to believe that for a brief moment in time. that black, I realize now the issue was I personally do not like math, but it isn't that black people can't do math. Just to give you an example of these preconceived notions. So reading about that, that at a moment in time, Egypt was a black civilization and the high levels of math. And then in the blue book, he deals with that. He pulls out mathematical equations, Joke does, that the black Africans, black Egyptians developed. You know, and then I'm like, wow, you know, these were doing higher level math without computers that people struggle with today with calculators and computers. You know, so just as a one of many preconceived notions that I had, that was taught to me by society, even despite my parents' efforts. That's the insidious thing about some of the things we're talking about, that, I mean, you can be overwhelmed, overcame, inundated. I mean, watching cartoons for my class, I showed them some cartoons from my childhood. They were shocked and amazed that Bugs Bunny was a racist mofo. Shocked and amazed that Popeye was a racist guy. Shocked and amazed. And you can still get this on TV that your kids watch. Or when you have kids, your younger brothers and sisters, or when you have kids. That if you're not careful, they'll be in there zoned out in front of that TV, being just overwhelmed with racist imagery. You know, so yeah, definitely. I think someone would be dishonest, even if their father was Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, or whoever, to say that they didn't have some type of artificial, racialized, preconceived notions. That's the whole struggle.
Yeah, with me it's the same. And again, you know, I'm having this problem as a kid growing up watching Johnny Weissmuller, which is an old actor you probably know nothing about, play Tarzan, right? And I'm wondering, and I'm almost being socialized in a way that Africa is primitive, right? That's a preconceived notion, right? And that's a notion that's being kind of like, so there's this socialization process happening through TV, happening through cartoons, all this stuff we take for granted. But somebody's socializing us in a kind of racialistic sway, right? And so I'm wondering, you know, it's like, why can't we do this? Why haven't we done this? And then someone introduces me to the fact that all these black inventors,
Like, we did do it. We are doing it.
you know, it's like, so what's going on here?
Indeed.
Somebody led me to believe that we were not good in math, we couldn't do science. Ernest Just is developer of the very cell biology theory that they're using today in science, and no reference is ever made to Ernest Just cell theory, and which means that before we thought everything happened in the nucleus, the center of cell respiration and cell reproduction, cell respiration took place in the nucleus. Ernest Just, a black scientist, found out that it happens in the cytoplasm, the stuff outside the nucleus. Now all cell theory is based on that. Okay? When you learn biology, you learn this classical history that's strictly white, male-centered. Okay? So there's something happening with the omission of black people. I see no black people, okay, in this particular discipline. So by omission and by primatizing black people, it's creating a certain kind of self-esteem within you that you're buying into without realizing. And people who may be on a divergent end of a racial or ethnic spectrum are also being socialized in a certain way to think about you. Okay? So it's these kinds of things, growing up with these kinds of inner conflicts and then buying into some of that stuff that motivated me to seek out answers to it. Next. Try not to be too long-winded.
Do you think archaeologists and scientists have conducted enough research?
Conducted enough research.
Based on our topics, human origins,
I would,
Kemet.
yeah, that's a tough question. That's a good question, but that's a tough question. I mean, for me, I would say yes, but because there's still that debate, people are rejecting it, things of that nature. I would say you can never have too much research. It may not ever be enough research. So I guess it depends on who you ask. For me, I would say yes, because I'm satisfied. However, I'm aware that there's still people who won't accept it, and maybe they need to be beat over the head with more, research. I guess then it'd be a challenge. All right, I give you $10 million to find the oldest remains in Europe, and then we'll compare them to the oldest remains found in Africa. I mean, they've already done it, but people say, well, it has to be some older. Well, then go find them then. I mean, so that's why I say maybe, maybe not, but it probably depends on who you ask. But for me, I'm satisfied.
I'm satisfied as well.
Can't be. We don't have, we know about Aaron Woods Gates Jr. You probably watched the video when he goes there. And the population, I don't know if they're still there in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
These people that have been displaced,
Yes.
and they identify with those pharaohs. And the original, I just think, sorry,
Yeah.
So-
I'm just telling you what to say.
Okay, yeah. But so you're saying that the original Egyptians, the so-called Nubians, are displaced in modern Egypt?
Yes.
Right,
They
of course.
certainly are.
Yeah, certainly.
And
Right.
many of their communities, many of their ruins, and well, not ruins, but their remains and things of that nature have been destroyed with the floods. Resulted to the old dam where NASA created the dam, and then the new dam that they were constructed at the time that Professor Gates was there. And he went and talked to these people, and they were saying that they lived experience, like they're going through it right now, in their fight to try to preserve and save these things. So I don't know if the research if more archaeological stuff. So I would say yes to preserve and save these things. So in that context, yes, for heritage and preservation, in that context. But to prove the point of that, I don't think so. But to preserve human, because hey, 300 years from now, I'm not very optimistic about the way humans act all the time. They're gonna be like, nope, that didn't happen. They made it up. Because all the remains have been destroyed.
Right.
So it's real easy. I mean, they did that. That's why Napoleon shot the nose off the Sphinx.
That's really
To say, no, it didn't happen. That's why Alexander the Great burnt down the libraries in what they renamed Alexandria. I mean, they did that on purpose. I mean, there's documents hidden at the bottom of some of these oldest institutions in the world. They never want you to see, not because of no Illuminati Da Vinci Code stuff with Tom Hanks, because it's stuff in there that they don't want to be discussed, because it may threaten the hegemony of the institution or the powers, the money people. Say, no, we'll leave that there, I mean, so, yeah, historic preservation and heritage is beyond necessary, because once it's gone, then you can make up anything. Imagine if Dr. Joe wasn't able to uncover what he uncovered. I mean, we would have never known. What the rap song say, they ain't even know it, we would never even know it. I mean, they could have told us it was aliens. E.T. and his boys did it. And what could we have said? I'm sick. I mean, but hey, who knows what will be taught 100 years from now if things aren't accurately preserved. That's the whole point and basis of it. Destroying these African civilizations during slavery, and then especially during colonization, when whites gained hegemony over the European colonial powers, gained hegemony over these geospatial places, and literally could then destroy things. I mean,
Yeah, the earlier pyramids, in fact, are further south.
yes.
Yeah, and so not Upper Egypt, and the idea that those are crumbling, and nobody's taking care of those, nobody's making sure that they are preserved.
So with that, do you think that, and this is just something to think about, I mean, because I know I should be answering this, but I just want you to think critically about this. So do you think that one factor of the maintenance of power structures, right, or one way power structures are maintained is the suppression of knowledge? one way power structures are maintained can be reflected or found or revealed in the suppression of knowledge. So we say they're hiding the knowledge away, not just some conspiracy theory or some fanciful thesis or idea or theme in Da Vinci Code. This is some real historical stuff, right? Because if you can really bury that past, then not only can you privilege yourself or whatever dominant group as the so-called deserving superior group, you can make those oppressed classes buy into it too. Okay, Carter G. Woodson says, after so long and so much racial conditioning, right, the oppressed or vulnerable populations will make a backdoor if there's not a backdoor. What does that mean? You could be so racially socialized or conditioned in the way to think inferior about yourself. If there is no more inferior spaces that exist, you will create an inferior space for yourself. That's how deep the brainwash is. And it manifests itself in all kinds of ways. Okay?
I don't mean to rush, but I had to get out of here before 5.
Okay.
So
All
thank
right.
you all for
Thank you very
inviting me.
much. And are we able to email you as well?
Yes, ma'am. You can
Responses to
pass
the rest
along
of
my
them?
email
Okay.
to.
All right, wonderful.
That'd be great.
Thank you very much.
I just needed to collect those books because they're my favorite books.
Yeah. And
All
your,
right,
your
brother.
photocopy as
Give
well.
brother a hand.
Thank you. I wish I could stay, but I got to try to get over to this administrative building. 15 minutes.
15 minutes. So was there next question?
Yeah, okay. Do you know of any research currently being done on human origin? And if so, what is it?
Wow, you know, I don't think I do. My last, the last research I looked at was this National Genome Project. You should look into that. I don't know if you had a chance to, but Queens, New York, was considered one of the most diverse places in America, right? And they took like mitochondrial DNA from all these different phenotypical ethnic groups, phenotypes and ethnic groups, right? And what was astounding is stuff like this, is that there was this African American male, right, who was dark like me, right, that had a lot of European ancestry, right? And there was this white female who looked white and had a lot of African American or black ancestry. So these kinds of things, again, test this idea of race as a valid biological construct. And so if race is predominantly a social construct, it must mean that race is created and engineered for the sake of creating race-based privileges, sanctions, entitlements. Okay? If it's not truly biological, it must be a social construction to aggregate privileges, sanctions, access based on whatever your racial type can be identified through your phenotype. Does everybody understand what phenotype means? Your outward appearance, what you look like on the outside, right? Not to mention this notion of passing.
Oh, yeah.
Passing, and what we found out is that many people who think that they're purely white or have passed as white turned out to have a lot of black ancestry in them. And so there's at least, and I don't know if this is anything with the human origin, but I did look up something that said 350,000 white-looking black people passed over to the white side and never came back. Okay? At least 350,000 that we know of. All right? And so there's this author whose father was named Anatoly Broussard, and they make up what they call the Creole class, or Creole populations in Louisiana. And he turns out to be a famous black writer, claims to be a famous writer who passed as white, and on his deathbed, he says, his wife says, well, you don't know, your father's trying to tell you he's half black. So we have this 41-year-old woman who, for the last 41 years, thought that she was completely a white woman, you see. So why is this important? All this is important to understand, you know, when Diop talks about debunking the myth of racial superiority or race reconstruction, okay? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I have not. Maybe some more food for thought. Next question.
This will be the last one, folks, because it is time. We have about 2 more minutes before it's time for us to leave. Before you walk out of the room, though, you can get your letters. There are about 5 people. I still have to finish up yours, but everybody else should get yours today. So, Heather, I think your question would be a nice one to end with.
My question is, do you think we're still evolving?
You think we're still evolving? In what ways?
Like, do you think in the next many years there'll be different, maybe people working differently with different places?
I do think we're evolving on a number of levels, okay? Certainly I think we're evolving in a kind of way of consciousness, right? The way we operate efficiently with the knowledge that we get, right? Towards the kind of needed social change, right? But I also think and this may be a little weird, but I also think we're evolving physically. You know, like the browning of America, and not just in the sense where because if you look at American phenotypes, right, we really are amalgamation more of mixtures, right? That's really distinct from other types in the world. Check this out. You need to look at it, right? There's a difference to the way we look because of the constant mixture, and I'm not saying mixture as a bad thing, but the mixture of all these different ethnic groups that come together in this so-called pluralistic society or melting pot or amalgamation of American phenotypes, okay? So we're evolving that way, but we're also evolving in the sense where we have this cultural crossing, where we're adopting at one time, and America's always done this, we're adopting these different cultural habits from each other, right? Just like I learned that Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong influenced American singing more than anybody. Okay? And when you look at many so-called white singers and even white country stars, they all, quote unquote, are singing black now. Okay? So you got this going on too, right? So yeah, we're evolving, and it's inevitable, and for the most part, it's positive. You know, it's like last thing. It's like I was out one night, and we were all doing like that group dance, what we call the hustle, right? And I'm just like this. I observe so many stuff. So I saw like all these classes of people, all these different ethnic groups, right? Asian and whatever, black, and they were like all like jamming and moving to this hustle. You see, to this group dance thing. Yeah. And so the group dance thing becomes like this kind of space where we're adopting this kind of shared cultural reality, evolving into a space like that. You know,
when I was in Poland, a number of the women there, actually, maybe they watch a lot of television, but they were dancing like a lot of people we see on BET. It was really fascinating. I don't dance like that.
See,
but
that's the point I made.
They had adopted it.
Yeah, exactly. Can I read one last thing about Diop? And this is my final say. So, what Diop is doing is he's deconstructing the sacred screenplay of social history. Deconstructing the sacred screenplay of social history that was set forth in recorded ancient stone. The long narrative of human development in a way where African people, and therefore African societies, and therefore the African diaspora, and therefore African descendants, and therefore African Americans, and therefore black people and therefore people of color, and therefore the black man, and therefore the black woman can be its ultimate leading characters. You see, that's the problem. Black people can't be, that's the problem with this racism way of doing it. Black people can't be the ultimate leading characters in history. Okay? It's just like when you watch a TV show. TV shows reflect sometimes often lily white communities, you know, and seldom are TV shows that have black leading characters, you know, because racism constantly makes sense of itself. If the character is black, then it won't be universal. Then everybody won't watch it. It's the same thing. If black people, right, were like the ancient ancestors, how can that be universal? How can all these light people come out of some black source? You see? So, that's what I want to say.
All right. Just a second, please.
On behalf of the class, we would like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come here and answer our questions on human origin. Out of a range of things that you could have been doing, you came here and took the energy and effort to help us understand more information about this important topic. And excuse me. And you not only helped us to look at our thinking, but it helped us to process what it means to be human. So again, we thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me. Really. Now, I'm contactable via email. If there's any way I can continue a discourse with you, I'd be happy to do it. Okay.
All right. And so we'll have Sierra will be our contact person. She'll sing in a demographic
Okay.
information. The other questions that we didn't get answered, you can respond by
Yeah.
email. We truly appreciate it.
Okay, we'll
And you
do.
made up for last week.
Okay.